take home, I think, from this, yes, there are challenges, yes, there are solutions, but there's a lot of spatial variability. You know, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So again, we have to know that context. If we're thinking about applying the understanding to inform management, to think about climate adaptation funding, all of those types of issues. Okay, so clearly there are challenges and changes at the present, but we can see that from the paleo record, so I'm going to take you back through the last sort of 20-odd thousand years, and we go to places like this. This is again on Mount Kenya, a place called Ramuku Swamp. You may recognize Stephen here. This is work he did during his PhD in about 20 years ago now, collecting sedimentary cores, and it's one of these wonderful sites where we have a record that goes back about 25,000 years. And this is just a record of fire history, and we can see as we come into the last 10,000 years, lots of fire started to happen in this catchment. And the whole so this is a record of all of the different taxa we have over time, and we can see that there's been lots of changes. So things like Poliscius wasn't very present in the last glacial period, but certainly became much more present in the present day. So these ecosystems are dynamic, they change. Again, is the key take-home from this quite complicated slide of paleoecology. And by documenting that change, understanding that change, we can start to feed into our understandings of management. Here's another good record from just across the border in Tanzania, from the Pare Mountains, produced by Gemma Finch, a South African PhD, now professor. Again, this is just a shorter record, only going back 1,300 years. But again, we can see this ecosystem has transformed massively over that period. Particularly, we see the transformation, so this is a record of fire history down here. So this is the charcoal data, and then put through like a wavelet analysis. We can see fires really took off around about 1,400 years ago as we move into the Anthropocene, but massively took off around about 1800. And that's 1700, 1800. And that was tied into particularly highly exploitative ivory trade and the arrival of crops, maize. You know, we all like our ugali. Clearly it's an imported crop, a crop coming in from Latin America. We know it arrived into Zanzibar, 1608. We have a record of its arrival, but then spread rapidly across, particularly across our mountains. And that very much fueled this exploitative ivory trade, you know, where we see that, you know, we've gone from, I don't know, maybe today, there's about 200,000 elephants across sort of the East African countries. Possibly 20 million would be a carrying capacity, largely disrupted. But again, so these records provide that documentary evidence of change. Removal of Ocotea uzumbarensis. Now, this is the Uzambara Mountains. You know, those endemic, really highly valuable timber trees, largely cleared during that colonial period of exploitation, replaced with exotics. And again, this provides context of the changes that have happened in our mountains. So we can take all of those individual records, you know, where we go to swamps, we take cores, we laboriously analyze sediments and samples through microscopes, generating the data. We can put that all together and understand, you know, what's happened across East Africa. And again, this is led by a former Kenyan PhD. student Esther Gathumbi, but also involving Rahab Kinyanjui, Stephen, of course, to understand those transitions that have happened across the region. And clearly we can see this is essentially change. We can see a lot of change happening around this period, around about 2,000 years ago. So the onset of the Iron Age across East Africa led to really whole-scale forest clearance and ecosystem transformation. Sorry, that's out of sync. And again, by joining all those dots together across the landscape, we can understand what happened to pastoral communities as the Sahara started to become desiccated from around about 6,000 years ago. Egypt started to collapse due to issues of rapid climate change, shifting people into Turkana particularly around about 6,000 years ago, but then spreading rapidly and covering the extent that we see today. Similarly for agriculture, we can see that early onset of agriculture started around about a couple of 2,000 years or so ago, but then again spread rapidly, particularly around the lowlands, and then more recently into the highland systems. So these paleo records allow us to really understand how these ecosystems have transformed. What the baselines are. Clearly when we're thinking about ecological restoration and all those contemporary issues, understanding about what the natural system could have been is very important. We can see that there's long-term human ecosystem interaction. So this is some archaeological work from the Pare Mountains, locally constructed water management systems going back about 2,000 years ago as the agricultural transition started to happen, as demands on resources started to happen. We can again tap into the historical photographic archive, again from the Usambara Mountains. We can see here, essentially it was a deforested landscape. It was a very, very intensively farmed landscape. We go back, we can repeat that photograph, that same mountain view, and you can see in the present day much more forest in the landscape. So again, just this idea that by understanding the past, we understand the directions of change, the timings of change, and that change isn't just a series of increased degradation and forest clearance. There was afforestation and changes in the system. So this is our Eastern Arc Mountains. So here's the Taita Hills over here for reference. Pare Mountain, where we had that paleo record for. The grey area is the paleo-ecological extent. So that's the natural extent of the Eastern Arc Mountains. Where you see colour is where there is existing forest today. As many of you may know, it's one of the so-called 17 or so biodiversity hotspots. It's probably, and certainly in my opinion, the hottest of those biodiversity hotspots, both in terms of species per unit area and also in terms of threat. So obviously biodiversity hotspots are a measure of threat as well as biodiversity. Of course, there's a lot of interest today in terms of managing these biodiversity hotspots. They've attracted hundreds of millions of dollars of conservation funding, various initiatives, afforestation programs, ecological restoration programs. So understanding where that baseline is, how much has been lost, when it was lost to who, is very, very important. And I would emphasize at the heart of our work, yes, we use lots of data, but we also do lots and lots of sort of field-based data. So we're actually producing lots of data, again, which is freely available. Yeah, so today there's lots of interest in carbon and managing our ecosystems for their carbon and carbon payments, again, as part of this response to climate change and things like REDD and various voluntary carbon schemes. So this is, again, some work we did as part of a large program looking at setting up lots of plots across many African mountain systems, measuring lots of trees, and understanding their carbon storage. To be included in this paper, which came out a couple of years ago, all forest plots had to be from undisturbed sites. But the reality is, as we can see down here, the carbon storage, and they're all montane forest, varied from less than 50 tonnes per hectare to more than 450 tonnes per hectare. So a massive variation in how much carbon is stored in these forests. And that's largely to do, I think, with degradation. You know, so some measure of past human ecosystem interaction. Okay, so that's looked at the past, shown how important the past is, ideas of ecosystem transformations, understanding directions and timing of change, understanding the present through this network of plots. But clearly we want to try and understand the future. And, you know, for me, one of the key things about trying to understand the future is trying to get ahead of the challenges. You know, we're very good as scientists just to describe the challenge. We record degradation, we record impacts of invasive species, but that invasion has already happened. We record flooding impacts while the floodwaters are already risen. So we're trying to use models to get ahead of the future. We use climate models, and as many of you know, the challenge with climate change models is, well, the model grid cell. So here we have a global climate model. A typical grid cell covers the whole of the Ethiopian highlands. You know, so it's pretty useless in terms of actually and these problems are particularly acute within mountain systems. So what we've been doing is downscaling those statistically down to 25-kilometer grid cells, and then downscaling further to 1-kilometer grid cells in a project we had called AfriClim. And then looking at change across our mountain systems. So this is that 1-kilometer grid cell data, climate futures towards mid-21st century and the late 2050, 2090, climate change, degrees centigrade up here, and you can see some areas are getting particularly warmer, other areas are getting marginally warmer. But there's a lot of spatial variability in the climate change predictions. Clearly that's going to, towards end of this century, those changes are going to be quite severe. We look at this scale, there's a lot of talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and how we can achieve the Paris agreement. But the 1.5 isn't even on this scale. So clearly there are impacts of climate change ahead. We also, really want to focus on the things which are important, as we saw from those conversations with farmers across our mountains. It's water, it's seasonality shifts, which are really important. And we can see that from these paired pictures from the Tarangire, just a dry season and a wet season. Clearly, again, so 2050, 2090, some areas are predicted to get significantly drier, such as the Atlas Mountains and the Drakensberg down in South Africa, and the Cape Floral area. Other areas are predicted to get wetter into the future. And we've already started to see some of this happening. And a couple of years ago, Cape Town was almost having to close its airports because of running out of water. Clearly, although it's predicted to get wetter, it's not where that rainfall falls, because sometimes you can have extreme downpours, extreme floods. Other times you've got extreme drought. So it's not just that there's increased water, because obviously that could be quite a good thing, but it's the increased variability, which is clearly one of the challenges. So we can use those climate futures to understand the impact on our ecosystems, and we do this through a whole series of sort of niche model type projects. So one, taking those climate data, looking at one particular tree, Prunus africana, important commercial tree. And as you can see, there's less colour. So this is 2030, 2050, 2090. As we go through into the future, there's less colour on the map. Montane forest trees, not surprisingly, are going to lose habitat into the future. Okay, so I want to focus much more on a land use scenario tool that we've developed, and we developed this on the back of COP15, Copenhagen COP in 2009, I think it was. So yeah, it's just over nearly 17 years ago. We had a project working with Sokoine University in Tanzania, WWF Tanzania, to understand the future of forests, the future of carbon storage in Tanzania. So we developed this tool, which we call Casio, very much a participatory scenario modeling tool. I'll take you through the process. Participation at the beginning in terms of developing the scenarios, constructing the scenarios, and then we go away and do the modeling. We take all of this rich narrative, changing pixels of land from one type to another, and then participation in terms of the outputs. We've now run this in about 40 different projects across many locations, lots of workshops, bringing people together, and invariably it starts by bringing 30 or so people together, and representatives of community, of business, of local government, NGOs, media, research. So basically people who have an interest in land in that particular location. We focus on near and far futures. Clearly, when we started the work in 2009, the SDGs was a little bit further away than it is at the present. But effectively, it's understanding land use transitions at the near future and the far future. And the far future connects into that 2063 agenda of the African Union. Clearly, the future is a very complicated thing. So we start off the workshop. The workshops normally last about 3 days, 30 people coming together. Before trying to think about the future, we think about the past. So again, this connection between the past to the present to the future. So this is the example, again, led by another Kenyan PhD postdoc, now professor in Arizona, Rebecca Karaoke. Some work she did around the Serengeti system, understanding the history of that from the participants in the room. And we were able to go back to sort of 1920 and thinking about what had changed in that landscape, what had driven that change. So some of them are policy changes. So 1940, Serengeti declared as a national park. The Arusha Declaration in 67. National land use policies in 95. Others are climatic, so droughts in 87, earthquakes. Here there was an El Nino. 98, 2006 drought. There would have been obviously a 2009 drought. Uganda, Tanzania war, so all of the things that have impacted that landscape. So that gets people thinking about drivers and change. And I say we started off working in Tanzania, and we ran, or Claudia Capitani, who led this work, ran 7 workshops in different parts of Tanzania to look at what the carbon futures of the land could be at a national level. So it was quite a big project involving, let's say, 7 workshops, so more than 200 people, and then taking lots of narrative, and then lots of modeling and GIS. And effectively, the output was a map of forest loss. So this is forest loss across Tanzania, places like the Serengeti, or Selous, or some of the protected areas of the Eastern Arc can't exchange forest loss, but that forest loss is happening. Countries like Tanzania, like Kenya, with a rapidly growing population, economy, expanding agriculture. Of course, people need more things to eat, and that's going to impact the forest systems. But less so under a green economy. So there's just 2 scenarios: a business as usual, a green economy scenario. And we can see there's much less blue into the green economy than a business as usual. Just purely on carbon market and carbon price, the difference between the left and the right is $8 billion of payment. So straight away, that starts to sharpen the focus of the Forestry Department, the Ministry of Lands, the agricultural ministries. And this is all embedded within what they now call their National Carbon Monitoring Centre, based at Sokoine. Importantly, and again, this is a really complicated slide, we can look at the interaction between carbon, that I've just showed you in the previous slide, and changes in water and changes in biodiversity. So it's those understanding how that forest loss that we saw here will impact on biodiversity and water supply, and where those impacts are particularly acute. So places like the Pugu Hills here, close to Dar es Salaam, even under the greenest economy, the brightest future that could be imagined by the participants in the workshop, there's going to be forest loss. There's going to, that just because of the population pressure from Dar es Salaam, one of the fastest growing cities across the continent. Other places, such as up in the Eastern Arc here, we've got high impacts on carbon and biodiversity. Over towards the Mwanza area, high impact on carbon and water. So it allows us to direct some of our scarce management resources to try and intervene. Okay, so the nice thing about this tool, so that was the first application. We've used it in many different projects subsequently, and I'll show you a couple of case studies. First of all, from a place where I say was yesterday, down in the Amboseli system. And this is essentially that process, okay? So these aren't predictions. What we do, we want to understand land use transformations and what the future of that land could be like. So these are the 4 scenarios towards 2063, as envisaged by the communities that came into our workshops. And that was, again, lots of sort of Maasai pastoralists, lots of people from NGOs, people from Kajero Land Use Planning Office. And we can see, so the pink is agriculture, the red is the built-up land, and the forest is in green. So we can see under these different scenarios from a very aggressive that's a time. I mean, it means I'm getting should be getting close to the end. Yeah. So pink agriculture, green forest, red built-up land, and we can see there's very different ideas of what that future could be like. You know, and I guess we would all like to see a future where, you know, land is well managed, technology's being well used, rivers are running, you know, relatively blue. People are benefiting from that active and appropriate land management, and at least avoiding the futures where, you know, there's that continued dependency future, a future shrouded in corruption, or a future where big businesses are benefiting at the expense of local communities. And clearly, you know, this is impacting on things like wildlife and tourism, so Amboseli into Savo, impacted on our forest. So you can see under this quite aggressive potential future. Chulu Hills is massively impacted, much more so than under a more conservation-focused future. And that's going to impact on, you know, the water supply for Mombasa. So just to give an idea how the outputs are, this is 2030 for one scenario, 2063. That expansion of pink, of agriculture across the landscape, really aggressive. And I must admit, I've probably been working in that sort of landscape for about 20 years on different projects. And this type of rapid expansion of agriculture is certainly what I've experienced, you know, through my own eyes. And just to exemplify that expansion, these are two swamps. You know, I mentioned right at the beginning that connection between mountains and lowlands, really important. Essentially, these swamps, the water comes from Kilimanjaro through a whole series of sort of groundwater systems. A swamp within the Amboseli system, a swamp, this is a Nemalok swamp, just outside, about 20 kilometers away. So completely different systems. And clearly, you know, and this is a farm. This is in the Kamana conservation migration corridor, the corridor that connects Amboseli to Savo. You know, and literally, it took a year for this 200 hectare farm to be operational. You know, because essentially the system is, you know, you buy the land, you sink a borehole, and then you start producing very, very quickly. You know, and lots of people can transform these landscapes really quickly. So what future people want, you know, clearly there's a balancing act to be made. You know, do we want those highly productive agricultural futures? Of course, there's opportunities there. There's increased employment. You know, there's a driver of the economy. Or do we want to maintain that space for wildlife? Again, you know, tourism is what, 10% of Kenya's GDP? So again, there's an important discussion to be had here. Another example, so that was sort of national to regional, and now to a local example in some work we've been doing in Ethiopia, looking at agroforestry futures and particularly impacts of things like rust on agricultural production. So these are the scenarios, our present day, a sort of agroforestry future. So a future where, you know, agroforestry systems are intact, biodiversity is maintained, carbon is maintained in the landscape, versus a future where land is cleared. Coffee is no longer a viable crop. People get more from growing sugarcane. So, okay, I'm going to grow sugarcane. But if effectively we want to try and find systems to promote agroforestry and prevent that sort of forest clearance because of the wider impacts, the impacts on carbon, the impacts on biodiversity, impacts on soil loss, And so you go away from, short-term benefits in terms of increased money in your pocket to probably long-term, disbenefits from having a deforested and increasingly unproductive landscape. Yeah, so it's about really using these outputs, using these models to understand that whole ecosystem service provision. So those cultural services, those provisional services, regulating services. So things like, this could be timber, building materials. Regulating could be things like carbon or increased water management potential. And we can take those past scenarios that we saw from our business as usual, our intensive coffee and our agroforestry system, and clearly you can see under an agroforestry system there's more colour on our rings, so there's more wider benefits provided. Interestingly, those wider benefits are much more apparent to researchers and NGOs and people like myself than the community that live within those forests. Okay, so I'm getting nearly to the end of the project, and just to say we've applied this type of approach in, I say, multiple projects in multiple parts of the world, particularly on our mountain systems. And I work a lot with this group called the Mountain Research Initiative, and we run a socio-ecological futures group that has funding at the moment. So we've got funding and we use the money to support workshops and bring people together interested in mountains. So anybody who would like to be part of that, just let me know. And I'm just going to take 5 minutes now just to talk about a new project that literally is starting, 1st of June, whenever that was, about a week ago. Again, involving people within the museum, so Stephen, Rahab, Veronica, Emmanuel Indima from archaeology. That again is that connection between the past, the present, and the future. And then with a really important advisory board, including people like Dana Largo from the university. It's supported through the European Research Council. It's a project we called African. And it's really about bringing these tools and techniques together on mountains across Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, to really understand the future, and particularly the future economics of these transformations. So there's 4 co-PIs. There's myself as sort of leading the project. We're also linked with people from WITS University, the Global Change Institute, Laura Pereira, who's a participatory scenario person, vegetation modeler in Germany, Thomas Hickler, and an environmental economist from the Basque Centre for Climate Change, a guy called Unai Pascal, and then linked with National Museums, British Institute, Sokwini University, Cambridge University. And it's much part of this wider ecosystem of work going on across the area to really understand those long-term perspectives back to 6,000 years ago, to really understand how our present-day tapestry has been woven together through conservation policy, through historical trade networks, forest dynamics, fire dynamics, and to really understand our present day, and then use that understanding from the past to the present through our mountain socio-ecological systems to then model the future. And clearly, as we go into the far future, our range of uncertainty is going to increase massively. But certainly we're going to be using some really important tools and techniques, particularly around Nature's Futures framework, linking into IPBES, linking into these sort of global agreements, linking into national planning. So again, working with the Kenyan government on national land use planning, and the Council of County Governors and NEMA and all these organisations to really embed this work within the trying to make that sort of future and trying to get ahead of the problem. Okay, so this really is the last slide, and I'm happy to open questions. So things that we're doing is certainly taking our tool, our KSHO tool, this participatory scenario tool that we're very interested in, and we know is a really good way to connect people to landscape and understanding future transformations. I want to very much you put it into a tool for planning, for things like strategic environmental assessment, and I've got a meeting with NEMA this week to again discuss the reality of that. Applications to a range of places. Clearly we've applied this to cities, we've applied it to mountains, to mangroves. We have people working up in northern Kenya. Waso Lions are using the tool now to understand change in their location. One of the things that really happens within these workshops, it wasn't meant as an educational tool, it wasn't meant as a tool of awareness, it was purely meant as a tool to understand the future of forest, the futures of carbon. But by bringing people together, there's a lot of education, there's a lot of awareness that happens. That common understanding that people develop over the 3 days or so of being together. And we need to try and capture that better, because I think it is quite a powerful thing. Yes, there's lots of training, and we've run training courses in the past. I'm sure we'll run many in the future. Certainly thinking who our 30 or so participants are is really important. Certainly there's interactions between climate change and land use change, which we haven't really started to incorporate. And certainly what we're going to be doing in this new project is translating these perceived transitions to things like natural capital and putting value onto some of these scenarios, and to really understand what the biodiversity impacts are, and working with organisations like Reforest Africa to understand restoration interventions. The project will run for 6 years, and clearly we're just 1 week into the project. But certainly, I think over the next coming years, I think we will be generating some really nice insight. And the key thing for us, I think, is to use that insight to try, and get ahead of the problems. And that's where I shall leave it and open the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Very interesting talk. I would like to open up for questions. I've learned something. Ugali has killed forests. Have you seen that? The maize has killed forests. So that's one thing I've learned. So I would like to open up for questions. Maswali, raise your hands. I will take the first 3. 1, 2, 3. Let's start with George. Professor, I think you can pull a chair in case you feel tired.
So thanks so much, Prof. And that is an extremely interesting, look from the past, present, and of course, predicting what might happen in the future. You made a statement which has been one of my major troubles, working especially between the space of, can I say, making sense of what science gets to communities? Because you just said, for example, that some of the things that we do only make sense to scientists, and it makes sense to NGOs, and so when you put that to communities, then it's a problem at that point. So how do you, even the information that you're going to generate from the new project that you're talking about, how does that translate to finance and to support for community, so that then the science is in tandem with development, and that policy then also moves in that similar direction. Because clearly, I personally think there is a total disconnect between the scientists, the communities, and the policymakers. I am certain that if those three groups were in this room, they would probably decide to sit at different tables, because the policymakers understand one thing, and that is the direction where money is. Communities look at what impacts them, and yet conservation requires like sort of combined effort of all this. So what I ask is, so what happens? And we are currently, for example, dealing with looking at a scenario where, for example, it is a problem when we talk about, for example, water within the Mount Kenya and generally the Upper Iwasa. So we have an issue with water availability for wildlife. So, of course, conservation, people like us who want to pronounce ourselves to be conservationists will focus more on what will benefit the ecosystem, the wildlife, and then we realize, oh, there are people living here, so is there anything for them? And the people want to look at themselves first. And therefore, there is a general tendency of maintaining the status quo, more like saying, the way things are usually currently. So how do we marry these three groups, research, policy, and management, and also now, general communities? Because it does not matter how much information we generate. Do you think this will really make sense to support us get a sustainable future that we're looking forward?
George is a politician, so just a minute.
There was certainly more than one question there. But I'll try to remember them, and because if I don't, just come back and we can.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for that good presentation. It was so interdisciplinary, cross-cutting across different dimensions. I am Charity Barasa from the University of Eldoret. My first question is that now that you've seen the past and projected about the future, and we've seen from the pictures a lot of land degradation, and now that the population is increasing, we are not reducing anymore, do you see an opportunity for restoration of our ecosystem? And how can we pick them up and run with it so that in your projection I saw that it could get drier in future? What can we do to curb that so that we don't get to that dry situation? Secondly, you talked about carbon sources in water, which is actually my area of interest. I don't know whether you've already done that research already, but I'll wish to understand, was the carbon more from the terrestrial or from the aquatic column? Where was it from? From that understanding, managers of water will be able to know where to control, how to manage. Is it the terrestrial? Is it the water? We will have a better understanding of where to start from to save our aquatic ecosystems. Thank you.
Final one from Leslie.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that very wonderful presentation. My name is Dr. Margaret Murioki from Karatina University. I would like to ask a question about the Amboseli ecosystem, particularly regarding your modeling of the past, the present, and the future, about the governance that we had in the past, although we still have it in the present, about protectionist kind of conservation, and now we have community-based conservation coming in. So how is that likely to model the scenario in the future in terms of now having a more participatory form of governance? Also, on the same token, then we also have a scenario of land use change, which is also somehow influenced by governance, from the communal that we had in the past in that area. Then we had group ranch, And now we are moving into individual parcels of land, which have influenced now the agricultural expansion in that area, particularly the changes we've had in Kemana, the Namelok swamp. So how is that likely to affect the future scenario? Thank you.
Maybe, Prof, you can pick those three first.
Well, I said if I can remember them. So maybe let's start with Amboseli, and we'll work backwards, I think, and then you can refresh my memory as we get down here. The Amboseli system's really interesting. It's clearly dynamic. We've worked on that location and understood it for about 4,000 years of ecosystem history. Literally yesterday I was sat under a tree with community members that I've known for about 20 years, talking about all of those current day challenges that are happening across the landscape, particularly as potentially, I know there's still a lot of discussion, potentially heads back to Kajero administration and away from KWS. How the communities can understand those transitions and how that's going to change the landscape. Certainly it is a very dynamic and changing landscape. We see this already with the ownership and the title deeds, and already I can see, the person that I know, 20 years ago he was in a very small hut within a manyatta, then got to a bigger hut, and then with solar, and now he's built himself his own house with his own compound and taken himself outside of the manyatta system. And so, clearly those evidences of changes are happening very quickly, and, I travelled there along a new road that's being constructed, straight to a new lodge that's been put up by the governor of Kajero, and then to another lodge that's been put up by Ruto, and these changes are really, really quick. How we can navigate through this process is where I think tools like this K-show approach are really important, because they bring people together and they allow people to understand what's driving those changes, such as the road, how that's going to impact the communities that live along that road, how that's going to increase the value of land along that road, how that's going to increase how much land is given over to agriculture versus how much maintains that sort of openness and conservation value. What we really need to do is increase the value of things like biodiversity credits, of conservation value, so that the land conservation land isn't just viewed as, or rangeland isn't just viewed as land just for cattle or goats. There is a value for the conservation, and that value comes back into the community pocket. But clearly those mechanisms aren't there yet. But I think there is movement in the right direction to ensure that those mechanisms do happen. So clearly, lots of changes going on across Amboseli at the moment. When I say lots of changes that have happened in the 20 years that I've been familiar with that landscape. One of the challenges, I think, are particularly the contested nature of the NGOs. We've got Big Life, I4, ACC. They're all somewhat competing for the conservation kudos and the impact that's having across that landscape. And again, these types of tools allow things to be a bit more joined up. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question a little bit. For the carbon issue, that's an easy one. It was from, essentially we measure trees, so it's all above ground carbon. It's the above ground biomass. The big hole, I think, for us is the below ground biomass. So we do have in Tanzania 121 hectare plots where we've measured the above ground and the below ground. We've yet to publish that data. So yeah, it's certainly the above ground focus. I think the aquatic system that you mentioned is a whole other area. As you can see, I've already got involved in quite a few areas. I don't have capacity to get involved in aquatic carbon cycling and storage, but clearly it's an important issue. I mean, we worked in a lot of mangrove systems. In fact, we've just published a paper from the Lamu area and across those archipelagos where we looked at above and below ground storage. Clearly, you've got above ground about 30 tons per hectare, below ground up to 1,000 tons per hectare. So way more than the montane rainforest. So certainly understanding those systems and the storage, particularly in the sediments, really important. And getting that into the finance and the carbon finance system, very important. And hopefully that's something that will happen into the future. Does that answer that question, I think? And was there another one as well? Or? For restoration? Yes. Yeah, so I hasten to add, these aren't predictions, what I've showed. They're scenarios. And all of those scenarios are possible, from the highly degraded, highly transformed, highly industrialized landscapes to the ones where there is a sort of, less transformation, greater intactness, greater integrity. But clearly that needs to then link into the things I just mentioned about payments and compensation, and that the benefits accrue down to the communities that are, foregoing that transformation of land to agriculture. Okay. And then lastly, issues of policy, how we connect with political, mandates, and clearly that in itself is incredibly dynamic. Clearly, we know. You have elections next year. We'll see where that takes us. But again, could be a shifting of the pack, or a reshuffling of the pack in terms of what's important. Again, I go back to this idea that these tools are really important. This participatory process and bringing people in from the policy side at the beginning is a really important thing that I think we need to do more of. I've been involved in many projects where we do the typical thing. We go away, we do the science, we produce a policy brief. I remember this cartoon of a guy with a minister, and there's a big pile of policy briefs sat on his desk. Another one comes. They don't really have the impact. But by engaging people from the beginning, and so that when we're producing the outputs, it's stuff that's been co-produced, it's stuff that they've produced as much as people like myself. It's much easier to then use the evidence to inform appropriate policy. On the issue of policy, I would say, we know there are no shortages of good policies. There are really good policies out there. Issues of implementation and then enforcement is a whole other minefield. Again, we can go back to Amboseli. I showed you some of that recent farming activity that's come up in the migratory corridor. There was, people may be familiar with, there was a big avocado farm that went up about 4 or 5 years ago. Again, a lot of contested and protracted legal case ensued. In fact, I was with some colleagues last week, and effectively I ended up having to sue NEMA for not imposing the appropriate policy, and now that farm has had to be removed or returned back to rangeland and allow for passage of animals through that landscape. So connecting with policymakers from the beginning is really important. Finding ways to communicate our science better than the traditional policy brief, really important. And again, we've made lots of films and videos and theatre groups, and just look at different conduits and ways to engage, I think is very important. And keep on having those conversations, from, I say yesterday I was sat under a number of trees, great conversations, really useful. And then tomorrow I'll be in the UN, and the day after I'll be with NEMA, just keeping about those conversations going. Because I think there's a long way to go in terms of making these sort of global policies and all of the finance that trickles down from international to national to local level. But again, that's incumbent on us, I think, to do the communication better. Because yes, we produce lots of papers and lots of Nature articles and all of that sort of stuff. That's not what they're interested in. Policy briefs is not what they're interested in. So yeah, and I think.
My example is just very simple. Is just how this very good information. The entire group you see here is almost like you can call it a choir.
Yes. Yeah.
But there is the major people on the ground
Mm.
where all this information that you give them needs to be converted into finance and actionable
Yeah.
programs that change their lives.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and that is the disconnect, and so that's why in our new project, and also in the past, we've worked with environmental economists. So the new African project, one of the key work streams, is about translating all of this change into monetary value, or value through this Nature Futures framework. And a good example of where that happens is the Tanzanian carbon futures example that I showed you. So since I'm familiar, so certainly there's been decades of work, hundreds of millions of conservation finance gone into the Eastern Arc Mountains for endemic pigeons, new mangabey, three-horned chameleons, the importance of whatever we're interested in. Has that worked? No. Deforestation has continued. Forest clearance has continued. As soon as we start to talk about money and saying, well, this forest is worth lots of, $8 billion if you manage it in a good way, because I myself am not interested in, I love seeing three-horned chameleons and endemic birds. I'm not interested in seeing a lot of carbon. But translating some of the impacts in terms of monetary value resonates, because like you did say, I think, the policymakers, they're interested in money. And many of us probably in this room are not so financially driven, but we know people are.
Good. Makofi ya Rob, Professor. Thank you very much. Professor Rob, I think that was quite insightful. In the interest of time, I could have picked a few more questions. But Professor Rob, you're still around?
Oh, yeah, I'm around all week. I've got a few things, but I'll be around certainly all week.
So he's around all week. Sasa, grab him when you're having coffee. Talk more. These politics things. So I would like now, I would like to invite one of our sponsors, ICA, is a contact here. ICA, they need to say a word, so then we can break for a cup of tea for the next sessions to start at 11. You're here? Good, let them come. Thank you, Professor, for that insightful presentation and talk. And then, as we are waiting for the ICA colleague, yesterday we had a presentation here, and we are using this pointer. Someone went away with the thing connected to the laptop. So if your laptop went away with a thing which is not yours, please bring it back. So we can't use this pointer, and so we had to borrow one from the British, the FFI. So if you have that, if you had in a presentation in this room yesterday, please bring it back so that then we can use it for the other presentation. So colleague from ICA, good. So this is one of our sponsors for the conference. They need to say 1 or 2 words. Welcome.
Sorry. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I am Sophie Mumo from the insurance company of East and Central Africa. So we are outside there as the exhibitors. We'd like to, you can visit our tent, and maybe I can actually speak briefly about ICA Lion. ICA Lion began in Uganda as ICA Lion, as ICA, and in Kenya as Lion of Kenya. And it merged in the year 2012 as the ICA Lion of Kenya in the 1963. So we have over 20 branches in Kenya. They are all over the country. With the Western, Nyanza, you can always visit our branches there. Mostly what we do is insurance, pensions. I'm sure a majority of us are on a paycheck. So it depends on how you're looking at your retirement in the near future. We have parents that depend on us. We know how black tax works. So it's something we would not subject our children to. So you're welcome to our tent. Let's speak more about our retirement. Let's speak more about insurance. We have whole of life, where you pass your generation's wealth. We also have estate planning, whereby you plan for your future generation as well, and family trust as well, and wealth management. So we can always discuss more. Please pass by our tent. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. ICA is one of our sponsors in this conference. They are talking about the future. You have just come from the past. That's the future. So what Professor Roberts talked about looking at the past and looking into your future, ICA is looking at your future. So please visit economically. So please visit their tents. So now I would like we break for a health break, and the exhibitions where ICA is, there are quite a number of exhibits there. Please visit them now during this period as we have a cup of tea. The next session starts, the breakout session starts at 11 a.m. in the different rooms. So thank you very much for your attentiveness and patience through this process. And karibuni sana, and I've been your moderator, Paul Gasheru. Thank you. Have you been my property?